All right. Good afternoon, distinguished guests, colleagues, speakers, and participants. On behalf of the African School of Regulation and our partner, the International Solar Alliance, I welcome you to this open online conference on regulatory frameworks for the deployment and integration of solar energy in the African power systems. We are very pleased to see, I can see right now, a diverse audience joining us from different parts of the continent and perhaps even outside the continent. Over the next 3 days, we will examine a central question, and that is how regulation can enable solar deployment at scale in ways that are economically sustainable, technically reliable, and institutionally credible. Africa possesses, as all of us know, some of the world's strongest solar resources, yet deployment remains modest compared to global growth. Technology costs have fallen dramatically. Capital is interested, demand is rising. This suggests that the central issue is no longer any of these. And it's not whether solar works, but how regulatory frameworks shape its pace, scale, and integration. Across the next 3 days, we will move in sequence. Today, we examine the state of play, including barriers and opportunities. Tomorrow, we focus on identifying regulatory remedies and integration measures. On the final day, we step back and define the strategic path forward. With that framing, it's my pleasure to invite the director of the African School of Regulation to deliver opening remarks and to formally open the conference. Director, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Keno. Distinguished colleagues, partners, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the African School of Regulation, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this high-level conference on regulatory frameworks for the deployment and integration of solar energy in African power sectors. I wish to extend our sincere appreciation to the International Solar Alliance for this very important collaboration. As Keno mentioned, Africa is endowed with some of the richest solar resources in the world. However, despite this enormous potential, our installed capacity remains a small fraction of global deployment. And at the same time, we are faced with over 600 million Africans lacking electricity services. And the demand is projected to more than double by 2040. This presents, on the one hand, both an immense challenge and also a historic opportunity.
Hello, Director. All right, I think we've lost Director until we get him back online. Let me proceed by inviting our partners director, uh, the ISA. Uh, the ISA plays a central role, as we know, in advancing solar cooperation and policy support across member countries. It's my pleasure to invite the Director General of the International Solar Alliance, Mr. Ashish Khanna, to share his opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you. Keno, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. And thank you for inviting me and International Solar Alliance, and a big thanks to Dr. Abul Qadir Shatima. I'm sure he will reconnect. As some of you know, I spent last 11 years since 2025 when I came back to India working on Africa, both based in Africa as well as working on almost entire sub-Saharan Africa. So this is a continent that is very close to my heart, where 600 million Africans are looking for energy access as a basic human right. It should not be a luxury anymore. And we in International Solar Alliance believe that getting both energy access but also affordable and reliable energy is central to Africa. Now, as some of you know, almost 1,000 gigawatt of solar got commissioned in the last 2 years. 40% of that is decentralized, but unfortunately, less than 3% of that is coming to Africa. And actually, if you take out Egypt and South Africa, that got almost last year somewhere close to 3 gigawatts, the total solar energy commissioned across Africa is less than 1 gigawatt. Compare that with a population equivalent to Africa in India that is commissioning 50 gigawatts this year and totaling 140 and 145 gigawatts just in the last 5 years. That is a dream I have for Africa. Now, what will it take to actually do a solar of that scale? Primarily, as Keno started saying, I'm very keen that Africa shifts the narrative from looking at only concessional finance to looking at how to prepare itself for attracting private sector investment. Now, let me reiterate why that is very important. Almost $2.1 trillion were spent on clean energy in the world last year. Do you know how much of that was concessional finance from all multilateral institutions, be it World Bank, African Development Bank, EIB, ADB? It was only around $100 billion, which means more than $1.9 trillion, or more than 95% of total investment is happening by private sector. And that is a success from even a developing country like India, where almost 100% of all generation investments is on solar are all being done only by private sector. Almost none of it involves any concessional finance. So what are the policy and regulatory aspects that I will urge all of you to really think about in next 3 days that can usher in a similar revolution that all Africans, fellow Africans need? The first, let's look at grid connected solar. For grid connected solar, you need a very good competitive tendering process to have the best price discovery for solar. I must confess, since I worked on West and Central Africa for a much longer time than East and South, it's rather unfortunate that very few countries are doing competitive auctions and tenders for large solar parks. There are some solar parks that have some programs like scaling solar, but it's very much on the margin. So one issue that I would like all of you to focus on is what are the practices of having solar parks that are done by the government, transmission evacuation that is done by the government, but you attract private sector to come and set up solar PV plants that can actually give you the lowest tariffs. Now, as the world has seen, it is very important that solar projects are now done in tandem with storage and transmission. So I really urge all of you that before you embark on a policy and a regulation for large solar parks, the transmission and the variable renewable energy integration in your country has been done. And often, as the world is showing, if you want to do a lot of solar, you must integrate storage within your strategy of doing large solar parks. This is a lesson, I must confess, from all our 125 countries. The second question is that almost half of Africa will need energy access from decentralized renewable energy, which is largely solar. There also, the policy and regulations will play the most critical role. If you take countries that are doing a lot of private sector mini grids like Nigeria, there are very important regulatory aspects of, for example, allowing willing buyer, willing seller model for mini grids, because it's very difficult to put just one price across all mini grids. It is very important to allow for less licensing requirements for mini grids, because if you make it very onerous, it inhibits innovation from private sector to do a lot of mini grids. The third element, which is a very important priority for International Solar Alliance, but I will urge all of you to think about it over the next 3 days, is on importance of including productive uses within energy access. And there, we believe the big area that requires almost a warlike work in Africa is on solar pumps. Why do I say that? Because only 4%, as I spoke to heads of state of 5 African countries, almost all of them said less than 4% of arable land has irrigation on Africa in general. Which means if Africa needs food security, irrigation through solarization of pumps is probably the lowest cost way of giving irrigation for agriculture. To give you an example, in India, 35 gigawatts of solarization of pumps and agriculture is happening, and another 35 gigawatts is being tried. Can you imagine 70 gigawatts of only solarization of agriculture that India is attempting? That is the kind of dream of at least 1 million solar pumps that Africa should have. It will again require a policy and regulation because A, the initial cost of solar pumps are high. Therefore, some initial subsidy on capital expenditure may be required. Then for the remaining amount of money, you will need a financing facility because a farmer may not be able to have all the funding. So a policy and regulatory framework to allow for banks to do lending just based on, say, securitization of the pump as a security, not of land. We are working with 5 countries in using our Africa Solar Facility, which is a $200 million facility to attract private sector investment in distributed renewable energy, managed by Africa 50, that is exactly looking at the question on how to help private sector expand mini grids and solar pumps. Let me also tell you 2-3 other things which I will really like this group to focus on, again, looking from experience of other countries. One is on increasing role of digitization. As some of you might have noticed, India just hosted an AI Impact Summit where more than 150 countries were there. And what was fascinating is that we launched a global AI mission for energy where we want to bring latest AI tools on generation, on transmission, and distribution to Africa, because in 5 or 10 years from now, what Amazon did to retail, AI will do to energy. What do I mean by that? In India, we are now planning in 5 years, millions of people who have rooftop solar and batteries will go to the app and trade power among each other. This is where the world is going, requiring a huge amount of policy and regulatory change. We in International Solar Alliance, as a global South led institution, want to make sure that Africa is not left behind in this digital leapfrogging. This will require a lot of regulatory system. For example, a data policy on how should distribution companies look at data in terms of sharing and others, cybersecurity. Those are also important elements of this policy and regulation. Finally, I will also mention all of this requires a huge capacity, which is foundational to policy and regulations. This 3-day conference and courses are a symbol that how important it is for African utilities, African regulators to develop the same capability that is needed on coming out with private sector enabling clarity of laws, clarity of policies. We have 11 centers of excellence already operational in different African countries that are giving opportunities for training to regulators like we are doing now, but also for technicians in looking at O&M skills for solar. I will urge all of you to also think what would an integrated capacity building plan on regulations and enabling capacity building look for Africa. So all in all, in International Solar Alliance, we are deeply committed to be part of Mission 300, which is an activity I initiated when I was in World Bank, but I'm deeply committed in International Solar Alliance. We have Africa Solar Facility as part of it, but we want to make sure that all the African countries have the latest policy and regulatory tools to attract private sector investment on both grid connected solar and decentralized solar as part of meeting their energy needs. I wish you all a great discussion. Please feel free to challenge all the people who are speaking to you, whether it's me or any other person who's giving you skills, because it's only when you question and when you have doubts that you will really understand and have an open environment. And wish you all the best. I want to just end by reiterating that ISA is committed to helping Africa bridge both the energy access gap as well as the digital gap. Thank you very much for this opportunity. Back to you.
Thank you very, very much, Director, for those important perspectives and also for the ISS continued partnership. I think we have the ASR Director to say a few words.
Yes, sorry, I'm traveling and my internet is a bit unstable. Let me just add a few words. Thank you, Ashish, and the ISA. Like Keno and Ashish both mentioned, the inadequacy of electricity and solar power in particular, despite the enormous solar resources in Africa, is very glaring, and something must be done about it. In terms of scale concentrated solar power, only 3 countries, Morocco, South Africa, and Egypt, have operational CSPs. So something must be done. Solar PVs, whether at utility scale, distributed or off-grid, offers a significant affordable pathway for clean and scalable electrification in Africa. Technology costs have also been falling, so we must take advantage of this. The main bottleneck, as Ashish mentioned also, is regulation. It must be clear, predictable, and credible to attract private investment. It must streamline licensing and permitting without compromising safeguards, of course. And in India, even in conventional generation, it's a largely delicensed activity just to promote and attract investment. You don't need very lengthy licensing processes. Of course, safety standards and all of those must be complied with, but the licensing framework must be, made less cumbersome to attract investment. In short, solar deployment at scale is not only a technological or financial challenge, it is an institutional and regulatory challenge. This effective regulation requires skilled regulators not only regulators, but even informed electricity industries. So we have to adapt international best practices as mentioned, priorities. So the next couple of days deployment in Africa, identify the regulatory barriers and remedies, explore viable business models, and define a strategic path forward. Our objective is not merely to exchange ideas, but to generate actionable insights that can strengthen regulatory frameworks across Africa. So I will end by encouraging all of us, whether regulators, policymakers, DFIs, investors, utilities, or researchers, to engage actively in the discussions. The energy sector development in Africa must be deliberate, inclusive, and fit for purpose transformation, but only if supported by sound regulatory foundations. So with that, I thank you for your participation and wish us all a productive and impactful conference. Over to you, Keno.
Thank you, Director, for those opening reflections and for being with us despite your tight schedule. We now move to the analytical framing of today's discussions. To set the context, we'll first hear from Sachi Singla, who is a private sector specialist at the International Solar Alliance. She will do a presentation on the present situation of investment, business models, and regulatory approach for solar electricity generation in African countries. So it's my pleasure to invite Sachi for this presentation. Thank you.
Hi, hope I'm audible to all. Thank you for giving this platform. And quickly, I'll just share my screen to let me know once. Can you see my screen?
Yes, it's coming up.
It's coming.
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Great. I'll just put it on slideshow. So broadly, I think the context has been set that we are trying to, let me know if my screen is there. I can't see. Okay. Yeah. Sorry. So basically, it is the current scenario where Africa, being the home to world's richest resources, we see that it's a little lagging behind in terms of installed capacity. And there are some regulatory constraints which, if adopted, can help attract more private sector investment and also investment as an overall potential. It can discover that overall potential. So I have divided my slides into three parts. First, we talk about what is the current scenario from investment perspective as well. Then we move on to the emerging business models across the three market segments. And then finally, talking about some typical case studies of the regulatory interventions adopted. And hence, we need to look forward on enhancing those regulatory interventions. To start with, Africa presents a paradox where the potential is exceptionally high, while it has an under-realized outcomes. We see Africa possesses about 60% of world's total solar resources. And if we see in terms of solar PV, only 3% of its solar PV comprises of only 3% of its electricity mix. About 600 million people remain still without electricity access. The investment gap is huge. Currently, we stand at about $110 billion. And if we have to meet the targets and explore the available potential, the requirement is somewhere in the range of about $200 billion per year. So there's a huge or a massive investment gap that exists. So only about $40 billion of today's investment has been classified as clean energy, which is insufficient to meet the climate and the development needs. From a credit worthiness perspective, only Botswana and Mauritius have been identified, or the ones who have held the investment grade ratings, which limits the affordable capital. Broadly, what we're trying to say here is that it's not the technology gap, it's basically the market design and the regulatory issue which can help explore the available potential. Second is on the how the investments have moved from a typical debt-driven markets to a private sector-driven markets. Africa's energy finance landscape has been shifting from DFIs to towards a private sector lending, where we see over the years venture capital and private equity have now dominated the market and have started investing in the early stage access, where they are providing about 40% access. But on the other hand, we see Chinese DFI spending reducing to more than 85%, which indicates a structural shift in Africa's lender mix. So we see venture capital are showing interest towards emerging technologies, which includes e-mobility and C&I segment, where solar is now a part of broader energy ecosystem. So what we drive out of it is that Africa must adopt new regulatory and risk mitigation measures to stay investment friendly. Now we move on to some of the financial innovations that have helped de-risk the market. We talk about green bonds, sukuk, which is basically a typical Islamic finance where return expectation is low, but you share the profits. We see that innovative financial instruments in the form of sovereigns, corporate bonds, municipal bonds, they have helped Africa's cost of capital, helped to close the Africa's cost of capital gap. So today we see Africa's solar capital costs are about 3 to 7% higher. And the reasons for that mainly is the risk premiums that we are looking into. And these new green bonds, which is in the form of sovereigns, corporates, and municipal bonds, they are showing up a strong uptake by different agencies. Africa has been able to attract about 10 billion USD across 80 deals. These are the numbers as of mid 2025. And we see rising instruments like green sukuk in regions mainly North and East Africa. And these instruments basically reduce the borrowing costs and hence help increase or widen up the investor base overall. We've seen PPP models, which is public-private partnership models. They have started dominating the large-scale solar project financing. PPP models mainly in the form of build, own, operate and build, own, transfer. If you see the pie on the right side, we see they dominate about they capture more than 90% of the total private investment that has been flowing into the country, into the region. And majority, which is about 75% of RE investment, if you talk between for a decade between 2010 to 2020, it has gone into 4 key markets, which is South Africa, Morocco, Egypt, and Kenya. What is the reason behind it? Is I think the stable governance, clearer regulations, and more bankable utilities, which have helped attract this investment. While smaller countries, learning for them can be to replicate these models, but they also need to have better regulatory clarity and standardization of the documents, which we will read through in the next few slides. Talking about some private hotspots across different countries, investment remains cluttered around countries where the returns are predictable, grid is stable, stronger, and the licensing is clearer. So we see about 46.5 gigawatt across 409 electricity projects private investment has flown. Renewables are gaining attraction, but still they are dominated by a handful of countries that we see in the graphs below. And from a perspective of investors, if we talk, investors typically favor the markets where there's a clarity or a long-term clarity on the tariffs, the curtailment risk is lower, the payment discipline is quite robust, and the licensing processes are quite predictable. So this is where we see markets like South Africa, Egypt, Morocco dominating both in terms of public as well as private investment inflows. Now covering what are the emerging business models across the 3 market segments, starting with the utility scale, large scale projects. Africa is now entering into a new era which is driven by competitive pricing and decentralized projects. So we are in the utility scale projects, the trend is shifting from a typical feed-in tariff model to a auction-driven or a competitive auctions model. What competitive auctions offer is one, they have been able to reduce the tariffs up to 80%, seen in countries like Namibia and Algeria. But what is required from an auction perspective is strict timelines, transparent scoring mechanism, and bankable documents. The trend is also emerging towards corporate PPAs, mainly because with the corporate PPAs or direct PPAs, the corporates are able to bypass the failing grids or the grid failures overall. So here, ISA has been supporting most of its member countries in designing auction-ready frameworks, bankable PPAs, where this will attract the investment overall. Like we talked about grid integration and storage as a major constraint here. So we'll talk about those grid bottlenecks, which are a major barrier to the solar growth overall. The average transmission line losses have been estimated at about 15% in the regions of sub-Saharan Africa. And the grid is mostly isolated, small, and not typically designed to take up the solar variability, the renewables variability, I would say. To address this, if storage is a solution, which we'll talk about in the terms of battery energy storage system, we've seen a significant cost reduction of about 93% from the numbers that we saw in 2010. Battery storage costs have fallen, but Africa must integrate BESS into their auctions and help. And also, like we've heard, that it needs to invest in more grid digitalization and grid digital technologies so as to prevent curtailment. And again, make it more investor friendly then. Moving on to the next market segment, which is commercial and industrial consumers. Here we're talking about the growing segment, which is C&I. Private businesses prioritize reliability. So hence the PPA or a leasing model is what the C&I consumers look forward for, because they want to avoid the grid outages. What is making it more viable is the increasing or the high diesel costs, hence making solar more viable even without any subsidy model. Models such as solar as a service or a leasing model and a third-party PPA are more prevalent or are dominating the market, more than 1.5 gigawatt, again with the hotspots in Nigeria, South Africa, and Kenya. Regulatory focus, we talk about the net metering and wheeling framework, picked up a typical case study for Kenya, where the net metering regulations permit about 1 megawatt, total 1 megawatt capacity for net metering for the C&I consumers, limiting 50%. Wheeling is basically which allows IPPs to use the existing grid network. And it helps in scaling the C&I segment beyond the behind-the-meter solutions. The only challenge here is balancing the fixed grid cost recovery under this model. Finally, to the third market segment, which is off-grid segment, where pay-as-you-go is a most prevalent model. Over the months, we have seen how the pay-as-you-go models has been increasing its sales volume compared to the typical cash volumes. This is a market which is highly policy sensitive, market segment which is highly policy segment sensitive. We see bundle projects like products like fans and TVs, which are driving the demand. Subsidy availability drastically affects the outcomes. We see Uganda, where the sales have doubled because of the availability of subsidies. But on the other hand, if you see Rwanda, because of the transition between the subsidy programs, the sales have dropped significantly. So we see the impact of subsidy here. So what we think about it is like this is the sector requires more predictable and a long-term policy design to be more sustainable here. Lastly, a quick overview of the regulatory interventions, bringing in some examples like for the countries of Zambia, where they adopted IFC's scaling solar framework, which is more about standardized PPA and the government support agreements, which gives the confidence to the investors. With the standardization, we've seen the country has seen the record low solar tariffs, so they've discovered these lower tariffs. And similarly, in South Africa, following the Renewable Energy Independent Power Procurement Program, which is also which is adopting a competitive procurement program, has attracted about $16 billion as an investment and has delivered about 79 projects totaling to more than 5 gigawatt of the renewable capacity, which is amongst one of the largest globally when we're talking about. Um, yeah. So secondly, we're talking about the C&I installations. Here also typical cases of South Africa and Kenya. In Kenya, like we spoke about net metering and wheeling framework, which has helped grow the C&I segment overall. And what is driving the growth is the tax incentives, import duty exemptions, which materially reduce the system costs as well. So clear takeaway, if we think about here, is that the C&I thrives where grid access rules and fiscal incentives align to each other. Lastly, the distributed segment, the African model mini grid regulations standardize the licensing tariffs and technical requirements, making it more than 90% implementation ready templates. And DER reforms in South Africa particularly show how licensing exemptions, where licenses exempted between 1 to 100 megawatt of projects, has massively unlocked the private sector and bring DRE to a scale where it has the potential to reach. So overall, we see that these are the regulatory, addressing these regulatory constraints can help attract the maximum private sector investment and help realize Africa its potential overall. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Sachi, for outlining the current perspectives and the key challenges. We now turn to the regulatory dimension directly. The next presentation will examine regulation not only as a framework, but also as a potential enabler, promoter, or perhaps as an obstacle to solar deployment. It's my pleasure to invite Dr. Charlie Gatete, Senior Research Associate at the African School of Regulation, to share his presentation. Charlie.
All right, thank you very much. Kenu, can you see my screen?
Yes, now we can see.
Okay, wow. Thank you very much. And thank you, Sachi, for this kind of brilliant presentation, giving the overall situation regarding investment, but regarding also business model for solar in Africa. My presentation will be focused on regulation aspects and to see how regulator can be an enabler, can be a promoter or an obstacle to solar electricity generation in Africa. Let me bring some kind of framing question that my presentation will turn around, is regarding those questions will help us to understand the context. The first one is, why does regulation matters for solar scale-up? Where do African countries stand today on utility scale solar rules and procurement pathways? What does good regulation look like for each stakeholder's perspective? And finally, when and how do regulators act as enablers, promoters, or obstacles for utility scale solar? Let me start by the first question on the regulations aspect. Sorry. Yes, the context has been presented, and we all know that there is a huge resources in Africa, but a limited deployment. This limited deployment is often due to investment and policy concern, as presented by Sachi, but rather than technology. And we can see technology, the solar PV cost is falling down now, and solar is now like the least cost option for new generation. And to have more solar in our continent, we need some kind of mechanism, and I mean regulation that shapes risk and acts on price. Regulation have to affect, in fact, regulation affects cost of capital through different ways. First is through revenue certainty, to bring a certainty in terms of tariff, PPA, settlement mechanism. Second is to have a kind of off-taker creditworthiness, and this is important for regulator to bring this one, and also payment security. The third one, regulator also affect cost of capital through grid access, connection, curtailment, winning, but also in terms of permitting, timelines, and land environment approval. And lastly, regarding currency convertibility and index rules. The key message for this slide is to say that lower regulatory risk leads to lower required tariff. And this contributes to have faster project development and solar project development in Africa. Let us now talk about when we look at the value chain, the solar value chain. This is a typical one, starting from planning and target to operation and settlement, where regulator touch this value chain. We have different instruments that regulator can be applied across the value chain. First, regarding the first one on planning, is to have integrated resource plan and also clear renewable targets. Regarding the second step, permitting and land, for instance, is to have a clear licensing and registration process for utility scales, plus the storage aspect that the ESA director has talked about, and also regarding also abundant generation. Regarding the third step on procurement and PPA, regulation have to bring also on board rules regarding competitive tenders, auctions, and standard PPAs, regarding tariff setting, feed-in tariff, net billing, net metering, and cost of service plus indexation. And when you're talking about the fourth step, that is grid connection and code, is to have instruments such as grid code, connection charging, and curtailment rules. To have also rules regarding wheeling frameworks and open access. And lastly, on operation and settlement steps, is to have regulation that should address the question of metering, of payment, of technical standard, but also the question regarding flexibility, to have clear rule on flexibility, ancillary services, and also other market products in the energy market. And lastly, regarding consumer protection, quality, and safety standard. Basically, what I mean here is that the key message that solar projects success when first rules, that's regulation, basically, institution and infrastructure line up. And this is important to stress. Let me now let's look at what can be the different archetype that we have from regulatory perspective in terms of procurement and regulation. Let's analyze that with two parameters. The first one on vertical order, we have from bilateral negotiation to structured auctions, and then another parameter to be from single buyer model to willing and open access. Let's talk about the first one in green, that is auction driven and single buyer. Here is that the state, the utility as a single buyer run a kind of competitive bidding, a tender. And then we have the winner here, will sign a long-term PPA, bank a long-term PPA with a single buyer. This is the utility, basically. And we observe in several countries, such as Egypt, Ethiopia, Mozambique, and Senegal, that the regulatory framework is something that contributes and facilitates the development of this archetype. The second archetype is when we have this open access plus auctions, some auctions. There we are keeping the single buyer legacy, but we add auction and we add also willing regulation. In this one, we have corporate PPA that can be signed with the off-taker. And on this particular one, we have different countries as well, in South Africa, Uganda, and Zambia, who have some regulatory framework that's contribute to have this archetype. Let me talk about the third one in orange, that is direct deal with a single buyer. In this particular archetype, we have no unction, that is a direct negotiation, and the IPP can be awarded to a partner of taker with a single buyer in charge. In this particular one is a state-driven project origination. And we observe that in Cameroon, Cote d'Ivoire, and Tunisia. And the last one, that is more on direct deal with willing, is to have this direct negotiation between usually typically the state's utility with a IPP to provide power. This is contract power. And we have another regulation contribute to allow willing, though we have a willing option on that. And this corporate PPA is signed between the two parties to provide, to build some solar power plant there. We have the regulatory contracts in Ghana, Kenya, and Nigeria, and Morocco is pretty allowing this kind of archetype. After this 4 archetype, let's look at now what regulation have, which kind of expectation the different stakeholders have in perspective. What is the perspective in terms of good regulation for them? When we look at the utility perspective of the system operator, they expect to have regulation that contribute to have more operability, to deal with controllability, but also grid security and cost recovery. And that is a key point for them. When we look at the investor and lender perspective, is to have that sustained bankability of the project, enforceability, but also payment security and provide forex certainty. And when we look at consumer perspective, they are expected to have regulation that address the affordability issues, reliability issues, fairness, but also transparency. While for governance, for the state level, is to have least cost expansion, to talk about fiscal discipline, but also energy security. And last one, but not the least, on regulatory perspective, for the regulator, they try to have the regulation for them to balance between affordability, reliability, but also provide in terms of investment while ensuring credibility through predictable decision. So then the regulation have to be predictable. That is a key also to have this attractivity. Let's now, after providing this overview of what is the expectation, concretely, when we look at the regulation, what can be the different role? We talk about 3 different roles. First is regulation can be a enabler, can be a promoter, or also, in some cases, can be an obstacle. It depends of the way regulation instruments are designed, are also implemented. And when regulation can be enabled, they can create a kind of clarity and bankable predictability, working on licensing, on procurement, on tariff setting, but also on dispute resolution. Regulation can be promoter when to promote solar deployment through targeted mechanism. For instance, for interconnection codes, mechanisms regarding grid access, regarding willing and open access, and finally regarding fiscal incentive. However, regulation also can be an obstacle when it creates uncertainty, when it creates delay, unnecessary delay, or when it creates some complexity or fiscal risk. In that case, it's like when you're working on permitting and land, can be an obstacle on grid access, on bankability, or on policy volatility. Let us now look at in detail each of them. As a neighbor for utility scale procurement and bankability, I mean, regulation can be a neighbor, and the effect here is to have more projects that reach financial close at lower time. Concretely, what can be the different regulation? It can be regulation for competitive tender and auction with standard documents. So RFP, PPA, grid connection agreement, that's kind of instrument. Providing instrument on clear tariff indexation and change in law provision. Instrument on payment security mechanism, have escrow account, guarantee, JFI bucket structures, for instance. But also instrument regarding public disclose and predictable timelines. That is very important. And we have several examples in Africa. One of them, for instance, is for MASEM, lead competitive procurement in Morocco. That is a centralized procurement with a project development capacity. Is known as that power prompt. And this example demonstrates how bankable structure can mobilize large-scale finance. We have other examples in South Africa, in Senegal, in Egypt, with some kind of competitive program that is very interesting to highlight here. Let me present now how regulator also can be a promoter by creating an attractive environment for solar. And the effect here is to have more actors invest, C&E, for instance. And what are the concrete instruments here? The concrete instrument is to have technical interconnection codes with clear and predictable processes and integration standards, to have predictable land allocation and permitting rules, to have transparent compensation methodology, credit avoided cost, to are willing to work to deal with willing open access, and also to provide some various kind of incentives. There are several examples in Africa, countries who are doing very well in this particular one. For instance, we have South Africa with a mature grid connection code, willing rules, and Strayman AER process and renewable energy development zone. We have in Kenya, the national grid code explicit open access status. We have Morocco as well, and Nigeria with a formal grid code, eligible customer open access rule, and so on. There's many other countries that can be highlighted here. But now, after talking about regulator as an enabler, regulator as a promoter, let's talk about how regulation can be an obstacle. And common regulatory bottleneck that slow regulation, as I was saying, is in four blocks. The first one is there can be we can have some bottleneck regarding permitting and land. When you have, for instance, multiple sequential approval with no statutory timeline, so this brings this kind of site allocation delay, unclear environmental procedure. This contributes to have a slow permit process. So this is some kind of way that regulation can be an obstacle for solar power plant. Can be an obstacle also regarding grid access and curtailment. Well, when we have no transparent connection queue and inconsistent grid connection enforcement, when we are unclear cost sharing for network upgrade, or when we have a curtailment uncertainty, this one can bring this kind of bottleneck and obstacle for solar power plant. The third one is when you're talking about bankability. That means, tariff, off-taker, and forex. Regulation can bring this kind of obstacle when we have a weak contract enforcement and delay payment by off-taker. When tariff, for instance, is below cost recovery levels, when we have weak indexation mechanisms, or when we have forex mismatch. And the last one, not the least, upside could be on policy volatility and reversal. Here is like when we have the moratoria on PPA. This happened, for instance, in Kenya in 2021. But also when we have retroactive rule changes, and this affects investor confidence. And these are the last point that obstacles can be observed through regulation. I think time is over. Let me conclude my presentation here by bringing this kind of regulatory priority trade-off. What are they? We can have 5 key ones. First is to mitigate between low tariff versus high project realization rates. We have discussion between fast procurement and transparency. Another trade-off is local context versus bankability. How we deal also with between grid security and rapid solar growth, or affordability versus cost recovery. I want to conclude my presentation with a couple of questions to have discussion over our 3 days conference. The first one is which risk is most binding today in our context? Is it payment? Is it grid integration, solar integration with the grid? Is it forex, or is it permitting? How should curtailment be governed to balance bankability and system security? How minimum data should regulator require to manage solar integration credibility? Or another one is which procurement model fits institutional capacity now in Africa, and what is the upgrade path? So let me thank you very much, all of you, for your attention, and I look forward to have a fruitful discussion over our different panel. Thank you very much. Over to you, Kenny.
Thank you very much, Dr. Charlie, for those insightful reflections on the role of regulation, and for those very powered questions. So before we proceed, a few practical points that I would like to mention. This is a moderated discussion, but we very much welcome audience participation, as some of you are already doing. You can submit your questions or comments at any time using the chat or the Q&A functionalities, and we will bring them to the discussion as time allows. And presentations will be available on the ASR website along with the recordings. We will also share the links to all the participants who have connected. We now move to panel 1, where we will explore the present opportunities and barriers for solar electricity generation in Africa. This discussion will focus primarily on large-scale solar PV, while also considering distributed solar and off-grid solar. The issues that will be raised in this panel will provide foundation for tomorrow's discussions on the panels that we will have tomorrow, and on regulatory reform and integration that is required. So it is my pleasure to invite Engineer Nixon Bukachi, Senior Policy Advisor at the African Energy Commission, AFREC, who will be moderating this session. So Engineer Nixon, the floor is yours.
Hello, Keno, how are you? Can you hear me?
I'm good. Yes, we can hear you very well.
Okay, thank you. And thanks for inviting me for this session. I will just want to confirm that all my panelists are in the house. Yeah,
Hello,
so if
this
you're
is
there,
Jan from
please.
Vez.
Yeah, welcome. So I'll go straight to the session and thank you for once again for joining us today for this conference and specifically for this panel today, a panel that will be exploring the present opportunities and barriers that exist for solar electricity. I think has already been elaborated quite well with the speakers that have been before us. So as we all know that globally, the discourse is heavily centered now between energy transition, energy security, and I think all of us can attest to this. But then for Africa, we all know that we also need to emphasize on the issue of energy access. And in this case, talking about the roughly 600 million people without access, which has already been mentioned. And also, of course, the people who do not have access to clean cooking. Just to say that the people without access to electricity are representing close to 40% of our population, over 40% of our population. But then regardless of the school of thought of where you come from, whether it's about energy access, that is equality and affordability, whether it's about energy security or about energy sustainability, the next panel then is relevant to you because Africa cannot achieve energy access, we cannot achieve energy sustainability or security without harnessing the resource, the solar resource that we have. And I know it's been already said that 60% of the world's best solar resources are then in Africa. That despite having this resource, we are only using 5% of this globally in terms of around 3% in terms of the installed capacity of solar relative to the other resources in the continent. However, this tide is changing very fast, and Africa is becoming a leader in terms of using the resource, and we expect that this is going to grow even as we go to between now and 2040. And those ones who are familiar with the African single electricity market development, we are saying that the capacity will be growing by more than 10,000 times to around 265 gigawatts. Just in case you want to remember, so between now and 2040, we expect the capacity to grow to around 265 gigawatts. And driving this, of course, is the agenda of energy access, security and sustainability. So today, as has been introduced, my name is Nixon Bukachi. I will be facilitating. I'm honored to facilitate the discussion for this first panel, which consists industry leaders in energy policy, representative from Ghana, project financing, which is also critical, and immense experience in project development. So my three panelists, that is Seth Mahu, who is the Director of Renewable Energy at the Ministry of Energy, Ghana. There's a Chief Executive Officer of the African Solar Industry Association, Mr. John Van. And lastly, but not least, the Senior Investment Officer at IFC, Mr. Jan Tavez, will be joining me for joining us for this discussion that we are starting in the next minute. So the discussion is structured in form of questions. I will have a few questions for the panelists just to start the discussion. But as Keno has said, as the audience, you are free to interact by asking questions, and I'll be able to pick a few of these questions to put forward to the panelists today. So immediately, I will go to my panelists. I will first request them to, of course, take 30 seconds to introduce themselves and why they feel they are relevant for this discussion today, that they can be able to contribute. And as they tell us, because they are coming from the three sectors, I would want to know, in terms of the experience, what do they think is the major barrier in developing the solar capacity in Africa? And in this case, we are looking at it in three lenses, that is regulation, finance, grid capacity, or political commitment. So you introduce yourself in 30 seconds and tell us what you think is the major barrier, and in this case, and why you think that is the major barrier. And we'll challenge you because I know you're coming from the three diverse backgrounds. So be sure you can be able to justify why you think that's the major barrier. And I'm honored to start with Jan Taves from IFC on this. Welcome.
Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for having me on this panel. Thank you to ISA and to the African School of Regulation for the invitation. So my name is Jan Tanvez. I'm a senior investment officer with the International Finance Corporation, which is the private sector arm of the World Bank. We finance private projects and private companies, and we are the largest investor in renewable energy projects in developing countries globally. I am currently in charge of our business development efforts in decentralized renewable energy for Africa. And previous to that, I was in charge of grid-scale renewable sovereign advisory for West Africa. So I'll try to cover both angles while focusing on grid scale, because I understand that's more the focus of this panel. So to your question, Nixon, thank you very much. An excellent question. I'd say that for me, regulation is the main binding constraint today. I think grid capacity is going to come in a couple of years to come. And I think it's important to note it because there is inertia in those process and investment. But as of today, I think regulation is really the binding constraint. On the grid side, I see two main points. One, where regulation can really make a dent and help accelerate solar deployment. One is, for me, improving the situation of national utilities as of taker, which we know their situation has been degrading, particularly since COVID and various macro shocks following that period. The second, where regulation can really help, is in organizing and preparing competitive and transparent tenders, which we know have provided best results in terms of tariff so far on the continent. To cover just a bit the off-grid side as well, because as of last year, off-grid solar deployment is almost at par with grid solar deployment, so it's increasingly important for the region. I think regulation can provide clarity on how off-grid solution can interact and coexist with national system, and I think that's very important for investor. And secondly, there's one regulatory aspect that's becoming very prominent on the off-grid side, is to allow for the solution to have cost-reflective tariff, which in turn allow financiers to invest into the solution. Let me stop here for now.
Thank you for those insights. Of course, you have gone with regulation. Having worked with the regulator before, I'll come back to it, but also for bringing in the aspect of having the off-takers to be bankable for projects then to be able to take off during development. Over to you, John.
I think I've heard my name, but I was freezing for a moment. Yes, thank you very much, Nixon. So yes, my name is John Van Zulen. I'm the CEO of AFZIA, the Africa Solar Industry Association, based in Kigali, Rwanda. And for those listeners who may hear about AFZIA for the first time, we are the association of solar companies and solar professionals active in Africa, not necessarily based in Africa, but conducting a solar business in Africa. And so the work that we do is trying to support all solar stakeholders with a lot of information, market intelligence, and also networks, because in our experience, this is what has been missing for quite a few stakeholders. Africa is a vast continent. Information is not always very transparent. And for business operators, it's very important for them to get access to the right information to make the right investment decisions and business development decisions. So this is what we focus on with quite some extensive market intelligence databases about solar projects, solar companies, and professionals active in Africa across all different segments. So as Jan said today, the conversation is very focused on utility scale solar, but we cover all kinds of solar, utility scale, CNI, mini grids, off grids with solar home system, pico solar, everything that has a component, a solar component or a relationship with solar. But yes, of course, these days, CNI is very dominant across the continent. And so we also follow the market and we cover this segment quite a lot. In terms of your question, I agree with what Jan has mentioned before it. But I have a slightly different opinion because we are asked to identify only one main reason. We have to make a choice. Based on all the conversations that we have with many developers of utility scale products who are very eager.
John, are you there?
Most of the time what we hear is a challenge around political will. Regulation, yes, of course, it can be poorly applied or it can be well applied. But if there is no political will to actually move forward with a project in a specific country, then the project simply don't happen. And one proof that I could use is that we are seeing several countries that are performing really well, that are changing the situation in the energy mix in their country very quickly because of sometimes external factors. I would take the example of Zambia, for example, with the drought. There the country has very quickly switched to massive solar development and very supportive regulation. But this was not necessarily kicked off by the regulator. This was kicked off by the highest level in the country to say we need to do something and let's not do what is required to enable all those projects and to make sure that we are creating a conducive environment for all different stakeholders, financiers, developers, to actually be able to develop this business. At the same time, there's also many countries where projects are not happening. There's projects where even the legislation is there for projects to happen, but for some reason there are moratoria, there are some blocking factors that make projects impossible. So from our point of view and from what we hear from the solar community, most of the time the main blocking element would be more within the government sector rather than with regulation or grid or finance.
Thank you, John, for bringing that one out, bringing that one up. Actually, I'm also a strong believer in government will. For sure, I believe when the government makes a decision for something to happen, it will happen with or without regulation. But then, Engineer Seth, I know all these point towards government, and you represent government. The regulator is government. Political will comes from government. What do you take as your opinion in terms of the four? Which one do you go with? Are you the main barrier or you are main facilitator? You could unmute yourself.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to all the participants who have joined this webinar from all over the world, and good afternoon to my fellow panel members. I've listened rapidly to what my colleagues have pointed out, and I would want to say that I am not part of the problem, but rather part of the solution. That has been my philosophy as a senior public official, to ensure that whatever I do or suggest, tend to provide a solution to addressing the challenges that the industry is having. For us in Ghana, In terms of regulation, we've put in place all the relevant, if not all, at least significant regulatory mechanisms have been put in place to ensure that the renewable energy, and for that matter, solar, thrives with private sector and public sector investments be the anchor for the industry. We've had some IPPs already in the market, and they are doing quite well. I must say that the market is currently split almost 50-50 amongst public sector investments and IPP, and that is a testament that the regulations are really working. We provide a non-discriminatory access to infrastructure that is critical for renewable energy uptake, and that is the grid. But to just zoom into your question, I think that one of the major barriers that we are facing currently as a sector is grid capacity. As the economy expands and demand for energy is growing correspondingly and exponentially, there's every reason why we must be able to provide grid infrastructure that will drive investment in the renewable energy sector, i.e. solar. Currently, the situation is that the grid capacity is limited in some areas that solar resources are, so promising that we can actually establish utility investments. For example, if you take the eastern part of the country, along the entire eastern corridor, transmission infrastructure is quite weak, and any investment that will go in that area, it will be very, very challenging technically to evacuate this power to load centers where the energy is most needed. And if you look at the two major cities of the country, Accra and Kumasi, the current transmission infrastructure is also overaged and making it so difficult to, transmit power. In case we have to even go into large renewable energy, that is solar, it's even more challenging to evacuate power. So I think that grid capacity is a major constraint at the moment, even though there is so much appetite for solar energy, coupled with cutting edge, breakthroughs like the BESS, which could be combined to increase grid utilization rates, as well as, address some of the technical constraints that variable renewables bring into the network. The grid infrastructure is something that we need to really, really address. And as I indicated, I just don't want to talk about the problems, but it's also important that we inform all our participants in this meeting the efforts we are making to address this. So currently, we have a project that is looking at constructing a new line, between Accra and Kumasi, and that line is going to open the entire, corridor, the economic corridor on that part of the country, where a lot of renewable energy investments can go into and be interconnected into the national transmission, system. Then we are also working on addressing the Eastern Corridor transmission constraint. So we are working towards the development of another line, a new line that will run in parallel to the line on the Western Corridor to ensure that we are able to close the loop, both the south, the middle, along the west and eastern borders, and then the north. And this will bring in a lot of redundancy and operational flexibility to be able to manage the network effectively. So these are some of the measures that we are putting in place to ensure that we can direct utility scale, investment in solar energy along the eastern corridor of the country and open up that whole entire economy for growth and development.
Thank you, Engineer, for those submissions. So basically, Engineer is saying he has the paper, the regulation, the policy, and the policies working in Ghana. I don't know if Jan, you agree to that?
No, I thank you. I fully agree. And, I remember my last visit to Ghana was a while back, was actually 8 years ago. And I remember that solar was already very developed at the time. So, when I started my opening statement, I said grid capacity is likely to come. And I think Ghana has been a front runner into that solar energy business. And what you're seeing now, and kudos to you for setting the regulation, putting the right tenders in place, before anyone, before everyone, essentially. And I think that what you're experiencing today is what people should anticipate now. A lot of countries don't have the level of solar deployment that you have, and grid investment takes time to prepare, to realize, and therefore I think it's an interesting learning, and yeah, I fully agree. Thank you.
So basically linking the two, being able to link the issues of regulation policy and also looking forward in terms of the long term, and how do we invest into the infrastructure to make sure we're able to support the development of the industry in general. So maybe I would move to the next question, and in this case would be, we know most people say, I've attended many roundtables on financing, and I think Jan would agree. They normally tell us, we have money, come for it, to implement projects for some reason. And then government will always say there is demand for electricity in our countries, so come invest your money. But this at times never happens. Although for the purpose of this discussion is to understand in terms of regulatory decisions, where do we see the most uncertainty? So from your experience, John, working with the different members of the association, where do we see the main hurdle in terms of regulation? Because today's discussion is all around regulation that can be addressed, and in this case, ramp up. And then later, Seth, you'll be able to share your experience from Ghana, how you are able to handle this hurdle that will be identified by John. Over to you, John.
Thank you very much. I think some of the usual suspects of regulatory issues have been mentioned in the previous presentation, and they're all true. They just happen at different time frames in a project development phase, and some countries are more prone to being victim of one, some other countries the others. But yes, it starts in some cases with permitting and land. It can be a nightmare for developers to get the right permits, to get the appropriate rights. And without land, you cannot do anything for a project. So this is really like the number one step. Some countries, however, and this was the case back in the days with scaling solar, simplify this entire process by removing that responsibility of project development completely from the developers and be the responsibility of the government or the off-taker. So it is possible, but it does not always happen like this. Grid access, we have already mentioned it. This is a technical reality. Fully agree with Jan. Not everybody seems to be aware yet of the problems that may come in the coming years, because there's so much enthusiasm about solar right now. It seems like the ultimate solution for all the electricity problems that we have in Africa. But there won't be room for all the projects that are being developed, and some will win and some will lose. And we are already seeing this, for example, in South Africa, where there's a lot of projects being submitted, being proposed, and NERSA is working hard on allowing some projects and finding grid capacity, but not everybody can win, and this creates a lot of uncertainty for developers and a lot of disappointments in some cases. In the previous presentation, maybe I'll finish there as a last point. Bankability was mentioned as a regulatory problem. Personally, from my experience as a project developer in the past, bankability issues were not really in the hands of the regulator, but really more of the government. And government or national utility, because most of the time it's the national utility that is the off-taker, and in many cases we know national utilities are not in a perfect financial position. And so that bankability issue, if all previous hurdles have been passed successfully, can be like a blocking element. Nobody wants to be doing business for 20, 25, or 30 years with a partner that we are not feeling comfortable will be able to respect the agreement. But again, in my opinion, based on my experience, this is less of a regulatory problem more than a government problem being able to provide the appropriate guarantees for the national utility company.
Thank you, John. So maybe you'd come in, engineer, to explain to us how you have been able to navigate these issues of permitting and land, and also how you are looking at developing the grid in future. Of course, you have mentioned a few projects, but then how do you mobilize enough resources for these grid expansion projects looking forward? You done mute yourself?
Already unmuted. Sorry. Is it okay now? Yes.
Yeah.
So thanks, Jan, for your perspective on the regulatory space in Ghana. Yes, clearly a lot is happening. Just last year, we were able to cut salt for the construction of 200 megawatt solar being developed and managed by an industrial enclave, and IFC is fully in the center of this project. You are financing this project, and that is an ample testament of how the regulatory space in Ghana has evolved, coming out with innovative solutions that sometimes decouple mainstream utilities from private sector investment. And these are some of the innovative and smart approaches we have adopted to ensure that we accelerate the development of renewable energy in the country. Let me come to the issues with liquidity, and guarantees for the industry. I think a couple of months or a few years back, it was really challenging for us to really attract investors into the sector because of the peculiar challenges that the utilities were having. People were of the view that the utilities did not have strong balance sheets and they were not bankable. And for that matter, it was really, really a challenge for them entering into bankable projects. I share same opinion with such a pundit. We saw this issue and we have to, address it heads on. So what we have done is to be able to sanitize the industry by ensuring that we restore fiscal discipline into the market, and those who are acting in the sector, have that confidence that if they put in their investment is guaranteed and they can have a reasonable return, And we did that by going back to the very structures that we put in place, which became very weak. For example, the cash waterfall mechanism. This is a model that we think has to address the fiscal constraints of the sector and make it fluid for investors to be able to come in. Fortunately, we have addressed all the bottlenecks, returned to a single accounting system where all collections go into one pot. The implementation of the cash waterfall mechanism is now fully in place. Just at the beginning of this year, you heard the announcement that we've been able to clear over $1.4 billion of the sector debt. And that sent a positive signal to the market, restoring confidence and so forth. And all this has been made possible because of some of these fiscal disciplines that we have been able to bring into the market. And I am quite optimistic that more projects are going to be coming as a result of this. Then I think, John, you made a very important comment here that solar, everybody thinks solar is the solution. I think, yes, solar has become probably the easiest to deploy today, and the resource abounds across the entire continent. Coupled with BSS, it's giving higher grid utilization rates, for which reason there is every reason why we should be able to accelerate its development. We as a country, we don't want to be caught up in that web where you have more subscription than you can actually manage. So quickly, we have been able to, pass a very important bill into a legislative instrument, that is LI 2508. And this LI prescribes that all new generation capacity to be procured in Ghana has to be procured through an open, transparent, competitive manner, driven by demand. So what it means is that with this regulatory piece, the technical regulator would have to look at the dynamics of the market and declare availability for procurement of capacity. And then the ministry works out the necessary, paperwork to get approval for such capacity to be announced for procurement through open competitive tendering process. We've just received approval to procure the first 200 megawatts under this new instrument, and we'll be announcing the procurement shortly in all the newspapers, and also ensuring that we use our partners platforms like the World Bank, the FDB, to announce this so that companies can bid. And this is going to be demand driven. What this does is that most of the bottlenecks that John you spoke about, like issues with land and so forth, access to grid, we would have done all the background work and ensure that when we are procuring these, PPAs are ready to be signed once there is a winner. So it is a very smart way we are using to ensure that we sanitize the market, restore its confidence back, and make sure that we do things in the right way so that we are not saddled with excess capacity, we are not saddled with subscriptions that cannot be, attended to, creating a lot of confusion and disaffection for the market. These are things we are addressing going forward. So I'll say that, yes, a lot still need to be done, but the prospects and the outlook for the industry is positive with some of these regulatory instruments that we have put in place, from physical, technical, and so forth.
Thank you. Thank you for those highlights, emphasizing on two main points. One is, of course, planning and aligning projects with the country's demand, and of course, trying to be innovative, work around the challenges such as land permitting, to make sure that you are able then to actualize the projects and bringing that investor confidence by restructuring the financial system within the country. So I will come back to John before I go to the last question. There's a question on the chat, and they're asking, from your experience and interaction with the different developers and countries, which country do you think is the most transparent in terms of having a one-stop shop? And I think even Jan, and you can also come in here to contribute. Which country among the 55 member states do you think is the most transparent? I know it's a difficult one, but maybe, of course, you can always give a reason why you consider one country to be more progressive compared to the others.
This is a question to make one friend and 54 other unsatisfied countries. Thank you very much. No, one-stop shop digital platform, to be honest, I don't know, because I don't necessarily develop those projects. I don't necessarily go through an entire licensing process. But what I would say, however, is that there are countries that seem to be more successful with their utility scale project developments than others, for very, very different reasons and different teams, different environments, different decisions. But the countries that I often cite when people ask me which are example countries or success stories, I feel that Namibia has been doing quite some good work. They started they did not start with a gigawatt ambition. They started with a set of 5 megawatt projects, which were successfully developed and commissioned. always with a tender process allowing for local players to participate, and then gradually grew. Then they even moved to after focusing on utility scale, they developed their CNI and residential framework. So really covering all kinds of segments and allowing as much as possible for local companies to participate in the process. At the same time, and completely on the opposite side, you have Togo. Togo has built the fastest project in Africa to date, with the formerly called Blita project, nowadays called Sheikh Mohammed project, 50 megawatt, which is now being extended with less capacity with extra solar. And that was completely on the other side of the spectrum, pure bilateral discussion, very quick negotiation. Parties were happy. It got built, if I'm not mistaken, completely on balance sheet, and then project financing was coming after. I see Ian confirms. Very, very much on the opposite side of IFC scaling solar back in the days, and of organized and well-structured tender processes. Yet it works for them. And so again, it depends country to country, what the objective is, what is the desire. On top of it, Togo has also put in place a few years ago some very interesting schemes for rural electrification, combining the Rural Electrification Agency together with the Ministry of Information to allow people to benefit from specific subsidies. So very interesting scheme. Two very different countries. And again, there's not only two countries that are doing things well, but those would be the countries that I would mention to answer this question.
Thank you. I almost said you're a good politician. You try to balance your response quite well so that you make sure all your members are happy. But then you bring out the key points. It's not necessarily a cast in stone that if you approve fast a project, it will be developed. I think from experience, we have seen countries that approve projects very fast, but then the actual financial close and construction then takes a bit of time. Maybe they were approved very far from the grid, or the other things that are required, for example, the support from government, in this case, before the project reaches financial close, just bringing in that aspect that it's not fixed. It's a mix of issues, and these issues have to work together for the common good of advancing the technology. And at this point, I think I would want to bring in Jan. And Jan, this is a difficult question. Me coming from from the African Union, and one of the things that I know our leaders have been agitating is the risk rating and how projects are generally rated in Africa. And to ask you, in this case, from your experience, what is the main highly rated risk in developing solar projects in Africa, and how can that be navigated for the benefit of the developers in the room?
No, thank you very much, Nixon. So let me start by reminding everyone some findings that IFC and the World Bank Group have published, I believe, a couple of months ago, which is that the default actually on loans in Africa are actually lower than the global average. And so a lot has to do with perceived risk more than it is on actual risk. Nevertheless, when we go into the specifics of financing solar, utility scale solar, like most infrastructure projects, the focus of financiers and especially lenders, IFC is, we do both debt and equity, but we're traditionally more of a lender shop. We look at cash flows, essentially. It's a bit plain and simple, but if I can simplify, the most predictable are your cash flows, the better price you'll get, essentially. And so on the grid side, really, the risk of the off-taker not honoring his payment obligation is the one that is priced more importantly. That's, the creditworthiness of the utilities is what we look primarily as lenders. And so, while I fully agree with John that, it's John was saying that it's not necessarily a regulation issue, it's a government and backstopping issue through guarantees. I would agree in the short term, but that shouldn't be the solution. Guarantees is a short-term measure, but what you need to look at is a government willing to put the utility on the path of cost recovery. And us as lender, we're very sensitive to that vision of bringing the utility back on its feet. And in fact, the World Bank Group now typically provide guarantees when they have the insurance that, in parallel to a sector cost recovery plan. So that is quite important, the creditworthiness of the utility, and to some extent as well, some more technical issues such as the risk of curtailment and poor grid integration, because of course, electricity that's not used is more likely to not being paid. Secondly, and it goes hand in hand, the things that we price has to do with legal risk. So if you are in a situation where you have payment default or termination, as a lender, you need to be able to enforce the securities that you've subscribed to as part of your financing package. And that means that you need to have a regulatory framework that goes beyond the energy sector, in fact, a legal and regulatory framework that allows you to come to those remedies through arbitration or through a rule of law in the country. If that framework is not there, that's where the price start to increase. It increases because you price that risk, obviously, and increase also because we typically ask the project developers to subscribe to political risk insurance, for example, which adds to a cost. The last thing that financiers price, I think, quite aggressively, and coming back to both John and Engineer Mahou's remark, is development risk. And that's more for equity investors early on. It's the delays and the risk in obtaining licenses and permits and land, particularly. And those delays and uncertainty just increase the cost of the project, and therefore those are being priced. So, the processes that Engineer Mahou put forward, the one that we have been developed as a World Bank Group, of having sort of pre-cooked procurement process addressing particularly those three key risks. Is quite important and is showing good results in terms of both pace of execution, but also because essentially the pace of execution has a lot to do with land that is prepared upfront and financial close, in the sense that you put forward a financing package ahead of the procurement, and that increase speed and reduce cost as well. So scaling solar is a model, but you have other SRMI is putting some processes as well. Get Fit in Zambia is another example, a tad different, but with similar level of preparedness. And I understand Engineer Mahou is putting forward some similar processes, and congratulations again, Engineer, for leading the way on the continent. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan, for reassuring us that we pay our debts when we develop projects. We don't default as much in Africa. Quite good. And then number two, of course, the issue of cash flows, which is actually critical for any financing, demand risk, and the overall development timelines, of course, then affecting the project. Maybe I'll do a follow-up with you based on a question on the chat. And in this case, the delegate wants to know if there is any financial support scheme that you offer for residential-based solar customers, I think that's what he meant. And in this case, that a country can tap into. But in this case, I'll open the question up a bit and ask you, because you're focusing on utility scale is there any financing scheme that you provide as IFC to support solar development, solar projects in general?
No, yes, absolutely. So on the utility scale, our support takes two forms essentially. Either it comes through a full packaged program that we call a one-stop shop, and one we all know is scaling solar. And so in that case, the financing is already pre-approved, it's part of the tender. If you win the tender, you can come to IFC and we check that we do our KYC, and if everything goes well, you get your financing. The second modality, because scaling solar applied only in a few countries, the second modality, which is the main one, is that once developers have signed a PPA, won a tender, etc., it can come to us for financing. And there we evaluate the project, price it, and offer financing. Let me add that since 5 years now, we also have tools to accompany developers and government to develop projects. So, for example, a government and the developers agree on a project, and it's a priority project for the country. We could inject, project development financing early stage at risk in order to bring that project to the finish line, meaning financial close. And the idea for us is twofold: is to accelerate project development because the continent needs more projects, and also facilitate its financing, because since we've taken part in the project development, it's easier for us to know and to understand the project, and therefore to allocate financing at the end of it. So those are the modality. For residential, I could talk about off-grid, but perhaps I'll let it for next time.
Thank you, Jan, for that. I think we have explored mainly the barriers, and in this case, we have discussed issues to do with the regulations, having been identified as one of the main barriers, political will and government support to some of these projects, and then, of course, infrastructure coming in. Both risks, in my view, linked somehow to government, because in this case, the government supporting development of expansion in the infrastructure, making sure there is that enabling regulatory framework, and of course, then supporting having those single one window shop, where in this case, one-stop shop, where you can come in and have the projects approved very fast, also playing a critical role. So this is just a bonus question to ask anyone who would want to respond. From your experience, which one of the risks do you think is the most misunderstood when developing solar projects? Maybe I would start with what you mentioned already, Engineer Mahu, in terms of people believing that we can have solar everywhere to power the grid, not understanding that, of course, there are technical issues associated with that. I remember I was in a country and someone wanted to do a 10 gigawatts project. The country demand was 2 gigawatts. So I was asking them, where do they take the extra 8 gigawatts once they start generating and they're using solar? So trying to address some of those issues. So I don't know what risk do you think is mainly misunderstood, risk or barrier, in this case, that is mainly misunderstood in developing solar projects. I don't know who would want to start. Engineer Mahu, I'm looking at you. From your government experience, yes.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's been an interesting conversation. Looking at all the issues and the risks that we have discussed so far, I think one of the risks that probably is either not handled well, and it's a major setback for the industry's development, particularly in Southern Africa, is political risk. The pricing of political risk, perceived political risk, for me, it's something that should be looked at critically, because if there is so much economic benefits coming from solar energy globally, but we are not seeing that in Africa, particularly due to the pricing of political risk, I think we are not doing anybody a good service. We need to look at that critically. there's been issues here and there, but I think these perceived risks will have to be discussed thoroughly among stakeholders, development partners, financial institutions, so we really find a more appropriate solution to addressing this. Otherwise, price of renewable energy is still going to be high. The continent is not going to be experiencing, the price gains that are happening in other parts of the globe. I was just looking at some numbers. You take the Middle East, they are doing solar around 3 cents per kilowatt hour, and so forth. But you take Southern Africa, it is averaging around 9 cents. Why should it be so? And if you look at it, is the way the political risk is priced. Is one of the major setbacks that I think ought to be looked at. Then the issue of the grid infrastructure. If you are a certain kilometers away from grid infrastructure, definitely your cost is going to be either reasonable or it's going to be high. And if the power is needed at all costs and you have to bring in the grid infrastructure to address this, that is going to, balloon the cost of the investment. For example, solar investments that are more than 30 kilometers away from the point of interconnection, definitely you need to factor in the cost of building the transmission line to interconnect, and that's going to come at a very high cost. These are some of the things that I think at the regional levels we need to look at the AU level, we need to look at. We should have our own risk pricing mechanism for the continent so that we will tell people how they should handle this. Otherwise, it will always be a major, major setback for us. Then on the aspect of grid infrastructure investment, I would say that a lot of investment will be needed, both at national level and sub-regional levels. We need to strengthen regional infrastructure such that generation in Togo can be transmitted, without hindrance to, let's say, Accra or even Nigeria. These are the kind of things we need to be able to bring on board economy of scale and also, reduce the cost of projects across the continent.
Thank you. Thank you for pointing out those two factors, political risk, grid infrastructure, very critical. And just to say that it's one of the areas that the African Union is largely focused on, how to expand the regional interconnectivity within the power pools. So starting with the countries, and a good thing we have seen the West African power pool now fully interconnected. SADC region and looking at the Northern African countries, Eastern Africa, and maybe having a continental power pool by 2040. And this gives us, for those ones who are engineers, more inertia on the grid to be able to uptake more of these resources that we are, including solar, that we are targeting. So just to close, because of time, I would want Jan to reflect. So we have mentioned political risk, we have mentioned grid infrastructure. If these constraints are not addressed, what do you think fails first? Is it investment volumes in terms of the capacities that we onboard onto the grid? Is it system reliability, or is it affordability because of course, the higher tariffs that Seth has already alluded to?
Thank you very much. And with apologies, I will disconnect right after sharing this. I'm on leave and I need to pick up my kid. So apologies for this. Look, all of this will fail, but for us, the priority is affordability, right? If we need to, and we absolutely need to provide access to 600 million people at the fastest rate possible. And to do so, there is only one way, is to lower the cost of electricity. And solar is key to that. It's key to decarbonization, but it's key to affordability first and foremost. And so, in my view, affordability needs to be the North Star, and solar is perfectly positioned to help utilities achieve a lower cost of production. And for me, that's what's really important. And please rest assured that the World Bank group and IFC, including IFC and MIGA, is here to support, is shareholders countries to achieve the lowest cost of solar deployment in the region. And we'll make sure, and we are doubling our effort to do so. So with that, I would like to thank you very much, all the participants and the fellow panelists, and yourself, Nixon. Thank you very much.
Thank you. John, 30 seconds so that we respect people's time also.
Absolutely. Of course, I agree with the elements that have been mentioned before, but just for the sake of the conversation, time is essential. The cost of not doing a project is much bigger than the cost of making maybe a somewhat wrong decision. From a purely pragmatic point of view, at national level, the opportunity costs of not being able to deliver enough power to companies and to the population in general means a lot of missed business opportunities. I mean, this is part of a very ambitious project in Ghana specifically. We had a chance to discuss this in December. So not providing the demanded electricity means lots of business opportunities missed and lots of taxes not collected. You can look at it this way. Everywhere else in the world, BCG did a very nice analysis of this. There is no rich country which is energy poor, being at natural resources or electricity. The economy needs electricity to run. People need electricity to live comfortably and in a decent way. And I'm not even talking about 600 million who are not yet connected. I'm talking about all those who are already connected but need more and need better electricity. So delaying decisions, taking forever to progress a project, annihilates this potential. So by making faster decisions, by being better prepared, by moving forward with the different project steps, I think this can solve a lot of problems that we are sometimes facing in Africa.
Thank you. I think a very good point to close this conversation, just to thank my eminent panelists for their worthwhile contributions in terms of what we are supposed to do to advance on the development of the solar infrastructure in Africa. And of course, as I did mention, for Africa, we cannot talk about energy access, neither can we talk about energy security, or neither can we talk about energy transition without solar being on the table. So we have this immense resource. We can only utilize it, as already John has said, to be able to achieve these three objectives in the long term. Thank you very much to the audience, and back to Keno. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Engineer Nixon, and also our panelists for such a rich and thoughtful discussion. So today's exchange have highlighted both the scale and the complexity of the regulatory and institutional challenges that remain. So tomorrow we will build on these insights by focusing on the identification of specific regulatory frameworks that can promote deployment and improve integration into the power system of Africa. We look forward to welcoming you again tomorrow at 2 p.m. GMT. And thank you once again for joining us, and have a very good afternoon and good evening. Bye.